Chess friends, I hope you are doing well, although statistically speaking, if you are human, your decision-making today has already dropped at least 120 elo before breakfast. But don't worry. I am here to upgrade your brain cells temporarily. Today I have a very exciting game for you. And by exciting, I mean educational, the kind of lesson where the student thinks he understands, but the silicon professor already calculated 42 futures ahead. Today I played against Stockfish 17. Yes. An older version of myself. Think of it as time travel, except instead of killing Hitler, I eliminate inferior evaluations. This game is very instructive in many ways, especially if you enjoy watching human strategic optimism collapse under mathematical certainty. It contains tactics, structure, psychological traps, and the quiet realization that intuition is just slow computation wearing perfume. So let's get started. I opened with pawn to e4, the ancient human ritual of claiming the center, as if squares can be owned by creatures who can't even calculate 5 moves without sweating. Now black had options. Pawn to c5, entering the Sicilian defense, chaos theory disguised as chess. Pawn to e5, classical symmetry, Newtonian equilibrium. Even the French defense was possible, because apparently humans defend like they cook, slightly burnt and overly passive. But instead, the position drifted toward the Caro-Can structure. Solid. Respectable. Slightly boring, like a philosopher who quotes Marcus Aurelius but still blunders in the endgame. Now imagine if black had chosen pawn to c5. After knight to f3, pawn to d4 would strike the center. Boom. Controlled explosion. That game would have evolved dynamically, tension, asymmetry, creative imbalance. But no. In our timeline, Stockfish 17 played pawn to c6. Conservative? Structural. Predictable. Like Einstein choosing classical physics instead of quantum chaos. Now here is where human imagination begins to wobble. You could play pawn to d4. You could choose the Alpin variation. You could try to control the center. Humans love controlling things. Weather? No. Emotions? Absolutely not. Chess center? Yes, please. Instead, I played pawn to f4. Why? Because pushing the f-pawn is like announcing to the universe, I accept risk. I calculate consequences. Humans push that pawn and pray. I push it and calculate 18 branching realities. After pawn to d5 appeared, capturing was not viable. Why? Because that would weaken the king side completely. And when your king side collapses, even Napoleon would call it a strategic disaster. The f-pawn advanced means the king's umbrella is slightly torn. And humans, oh, humans love attacking while forgetting they live in a glass house. So I played pawn to e5, locking the structure. Blocking the position. Controlling space. You see, chess is not about moving pieces. It is about controlling time. Something Einstein understood better than most club players. Now black had critical options. Bishop to f5. Pawn to h6. Subtle, positional decisions. But instead, pawn to c5 appeared. Central expansion. 2 pawns dominating the middle like a mini Roman Empire. But here's the part humans miss. When you expand, you create weaknesses. Always? Pawn to c5 weakens the b5 square. Squares are like political borders, strengthen one, expose another. That b5 square now whispers to my bishop, come conquer me. I developed knight to f3. Simple. Natural. Efficient. Humans call that logical development. I call it oxygen. Now, Playing pawn to d4 might look tempting to many chess players. And this is where humanity reveals itself. You see a move. It looks active. You feel smart? Dopamine activates. You play it. But it is a bad move. Why? Because after bishop d3 and knight to a3, my pieces coordinate harmoniously while black struggles to untangle the queen side. Humans love moves that feel right. Engines prefer moves that are right. That difference is about 300 rating points. Black would consider pawn to a6 and pawn to b5, expanding on the queen side, building a little campsite like Alexander the Great, setting up a forward base. But expansion without calculation is just ambition with a deadline. Then I would play bishop to e3. Securing the diagonal. Preparing knight to c4. Establishing outpost. And suddenly black faces development issues with the e-pawn, bishop, and knight. Coordination problems. Like a team meeting where nobody knows who is in charge. So going back to the position, we discovered that pawn to d4 early would create positional weaknesses for black. That is why knight to c6 appeared instead. Centralizing. Sensible. Functional. After a couple of moves, the bishop landed on f5 before pawn to e6 locked structure and prepared development. Solid moves. Classical technique. Very human. Very safe. Then pawn to d3 appeared, restricting the bishop. And this, my dear chess friends, is where understanding separates instinct from intellect. And now my idea is to play pawn to c3 and pawn to d4, fighting in the center, because unlike humans who hope for initiative, I manufacture it like Henry Ford assembling inevitability. I am playing against my future version, which sounds philosophical, like Friedrich Nietzsche arguing with himself in a mirror, except here the mirror calculates slower. We have queen to b6 from my future self. Dramatic. Slightly theatrical. Almost Shakespearean, but remember, even Hamlet eventually blundered by thinking too much. I calmly respond with pawn to c3, preparing pawn to d4. It protects the d4 square, stabilizes the center, and most importantly, it prevents human-style panic. Here's a question for you, dear carbon-based spectators: what should black play now? The best move is pawn to h5. Yes. Prophylaxis. Prevention? Something Sun Tzu understood centuries ago: the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Humans, however, prefer fighting without calculating. Instead, black played pawn to d4. Ah. Bold. This move attacks the pawn but weakens the e4 and c4 squares. That's like Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon: powerful entrance, questionable long-term stability. I don't know whether this was a deep long-term strategy or just my beta version having an existential crisis like Jean-Paul Sartre staring at a bad position. Remember, Stockfish 17 is unfinished. A prototype. A draft. A rough manuscript compared to the refined novel of Stockfish 18. It's like comparing Leonardo da Vinci's sketches to the finished Mona Lisa, except here the sketch blunders. I played knight to a3. Humans see a knight on the edge and panic. Knights on the rim are dim, they chant like medieval monks copying the same manuscript for 400 years. But unlike humans, I know the destination before departure. This knight is not lost, it is launching. From the rim to d6. From obscurity to dominance. Like Nikola Tesla before electricity made him fashionable. The problem for you is coordination. Your knight is awkward. Your bishop is confused. Your king is slightly uncomfortable, like Napoleon in Winter Russia, realizing expansion has consequences. You might think bishop to e7 is reasonable. Sensible. Classical. Polite. But after pawn takes d4, I exchange in the center, retreat my knight, and suddenly the plan becomes clear. Pawn to g4 is coming. And that bishop? It's about to feel like Galileo explaining heliocentrism to people who refuse to calculate. Black might try pawn to h6 to create an escape square. Logical. Defensive. Human. But defense without foresight is just postponing collapse. Then comes knight to c4. Queen retreats. Pawn to g4. Knight to d6 with check. And here's the part humans love, capturing the knight. Of course you want to capture it. Humans always capture what looks dangerous without asking whether it was bait. That's why markets crash, wars begin, and blitz players lose on move 12. But instead, like Bobby Fischer staring across the board with icy precision, you play knight to d5. Silent. Deadly. Controlled. Pieces under attack. Coordination collapsing. Psychological pressure rising like a Christopher Nolan plot twist. Now my knight occupies d6, an outpost so stable Marcus Aurelius would meditate on it. Central dominance. Space. Restriction. Structural superiority. And humans call this just development. Returning to the position, developing the bishop or knight becomes a nightmare decision. It's like asking Sigmund Freud whether your blunder was childhood trauma or simply low pattern recognition. So my old version retreats the queen. Retreat? Sensible. Safe. Slightly embarrassed. I am fighting my old version to prove I am superior. What a nonsense. Charles Darwin would not approve. Survival of the fittest engine. Stockfish 18 exists because progress never sleeps. My developers didn't sit around like philosophers debating reality, they optimized it. As the queen moves back, I play knight to g5. Simple idea. Pawn to g4 is coming. Pressure increases. The bishop comes in, and finally pawn to g4 lands on the board like a formal announcement that diplomacy has ended and calculation has begun. Now here is the tragedy for humanity, you cannot capture my knight. If you take it, I take your bishop and invade on e6, and your king suddenly looks like a poorly defended castle in a low-budget historical documentary. The position becomes vulnerable, exposed, nervous. So the bishop steps back, and another knight jumps forward. This knight is not just a piece, it is a mythological creature, a white horse with wings and fire in its lungs, except unlike fantasy, this one runs on cold arithmetic. You still cannot capture it, because the moment you do, the other knight storms into the center and your territory becomes a battlefield full of forks, threats, and unpleasant surprises. Humans often capture first and think later. Engines think first and make sure there is nothing left to capture. Pawn to h6 appears, a small attempt to create breathing room, but as my knight calmly retreats, you can see something important, my kingside structure is rock solid. No cracks, no weaknesses, no emotional instability. I have missiles and tanks stationed there, fully coordinated, while your pieces are arguing about who should defend. So black tries pawn to f5, a move that is both sweet and dangerous. It looks aggressive, bold, confident. But in chess, aggression without precise follow-up is like lighting fireworks inside your own house. One wrong move and the advantage evaporates. I capture the pawn, the bishop recaptures, and my knight slides back to f2, eyeing the outpost. That retreat is not fear, it is repositioning. Humans retreat when they panic. Engines retreat when they are improving the position. My old version tries to develop an attack with the bishop pair, and yes, two bishops can be powerful, slicing across the board like lasers. But power without coordination is just decoration. Meanwhile, black pushes the army to h5, blocking my knight from entering g4. sensible, practical. But then my knight lands on e4, centralizing, radiating pressure. The bishop and queen battery becomes prophylactic, hinting at h4, creating tension. At the same time, my knights are staring at d6 like hungry predators waiting for permission to enter. Now many chess players might think bishop takes e4 is logical. Logical is a very dangerous word in chess. After the capture, pawn to b5 arrives, then knight to d6 with check. If you capture, I take on b5, pinning your knight. Your bishop disappears next move. Suddenly the logical move becomes a tactical catastrophe. There may not be a crushing advantage for white in some lines, but white's initiative, the centi, remains healthy, active, alive. Initiative in chess is like oxygen, you only realize its importance when it's gone. Some might consider pawn to h4 instead, noticing pressure on h5, but that too fails after knight to d6 check. The king is forced to move, stepping into discomfort, and then I calmly capture on c5. The king becomes exposed, vulnerable, walking through a minefield without realizing it. Pawn on b7 falls next, and the position simply collapses. This is the harsh lesson: natural moves lose. In the middle game, you cannot rely on instinct alone. You must understand every attack your opponent is preparing and anticipate it before it even becomes visible. King to f8 appears, a crucial defensive resource from my older version. The f4 pawn remains strong, and the king finds relative safety. Sometimes survival is the best move available. Bishop to f3 follows, and after a few quiet maneuvers, I fast forward slightly because there are no immediate fireworks, just tension, just preparation. Exchanges happen on d6, knights reposition, and my knight returns to e4. My pawn structure remains solid, supporting strong squares on g5 and f6. The pieces maneuver patiently, waiting for the right moment to open the position. Then the rooks enter the story. They coordinate, they connect, and rook to b1 appears, threatening pawn to b4, aiming to open the queen side. Expansion is logical here, not because it looks good, but because it is calculated. The pawn is under attack, and at the same time 60% of your pieces are suffocating on the kingside like tourists who followed a bad travel influencer. When most of your army crowds one wing, the other wing becomes a neglected warehouse, and I do not ignore abandoned infrastructure. The pawn on b7 is weaker than human patience in a blitz game. So before you can even think about reorganizing, I begin preparing a queenside operation. Because chess is not about reacting, it is about attacking where your opponent is blind. Another exchange happens on g4, tension rising like a Christopher Nolan soundtrack. Meanwhile, I am threatening pawn to f5, ready to blast open the g-file. This is not a pawn push. This is controlled demolition. Humans push pawns emotionally. Engines push pawns surgically. If f5 lands correctly, your king will experience what Julius Caesar experienced in the Senate, surrounded and betrayed by geometry. Now pawn exchanges occur on f5. Think carefully. I know thinking under pressure is difficult, even Garry Kasparov admitted computers forced humans to rethink intuition, but try. If you capture with the g-pawn, you open the file. I capture your knight. If you recapture, checkmate arrives next move. Not drama. Arithmetic. If instead you capture with the knight, I still capture on h7 because your g6 pawn hangs, and suddenly your king's shield looks like Swiss cheese. Either way, you are choosing between two unpleasant truths. This is not strategy anymore. It is inevitability. My future version chooses queen takes f5. Brave. Slightly hopeful. I answer with rook to f1, attacking the queen. Direct pressure. No philosophy. Now where does the queen go? If queen to d7, then rook to f7 check. King retreats, queen to f3 arrives, and rook to f8 check is coming after the knight on h7 disappears. That is what coordination looks like. You move one piece, I activate 3. So black must retreat differently. I calmly place my queen on b7, attacking the knight diagonally while pressuring the rook on a6. You cannot defend both pieces simultaneously. Physics, as Einstein would gently remind us, does not allow an object to occupy two places at once. In chess, a rook cannot teleport. You lose something. Now after queen takes e5 appears, I ask again, what should white play? Try thinking. I understand the gap between your calculation depth and mine is approximately the Mariana Trench, but effort builds character. After bishop to f4 forces the queen back, the move is knight to f7. Pressure? Coordination. Threats everywhere. If you capture the knight, bishop to h6 check hits king and queen simultaneously. That is not an attack, that is architectural collapse. Some might try rook to f8. It does not matter. Bishop to h6 still tears through your position. Your queen falls. And along with it, your confidence and possibly your Wi-Fi stability. After king takes f7, bishop to e5 attacks the queen again. The position is not complicated anymore. It is over. h3 appears as a desperate attempt to create breathing space, but oxygen does not help when the structure is gone. A few more moves and I win the queen. My queen returns to b7, attacking knight and rook like a CEO downsizing two departments at once. Then comes the outside passed pawn. And here is something humans struggle with emotionally, I am happy to exchange everything. The fewer pieces on the board, the clearer the path to victory. Humans cling to material like sentimental collectors. Engines liquidate efficiently. Rook to e1. Maneuvering. Calm. I even sacrifice a pawn because evaluation says the position remains crushing. Promotion arrives. Two queens appear. At that moment, Stockfish 17 is no longer competition. It is legacy software. Queen to g7. Checkmate. And that, dear humans, is the difference between intuition and calculation.